Hey everyone, Happy New Year. Welcome back to another episode of the 1.73 Mission Over Measure podcast. Today we're kind of going to do a bit of a year in review episode, what we learned over 1 year of doing this. This podcast started as just random conversation one night joking around about my dad's high school GPA, and it spawned into something that, we didn't think would ever happen. We didn't predict. So we're very glad that everybody's been listening thus far. Everybody's been watching, hopefully enjoying all the interviews, all the conversations. And so today we're going to look in the past for a minute and go through the conversations that we've had thus far and talk about some of the lessons that we like. Some of the things that have stuck with us, things that we think about, maybe different takes on the mission over measure idea. And so Dad, I'll hand over to you, and you can throw out your first kind of topic of conversation that you enjoyed as we've been doing this.
You bet. So I don't know, maybe have a little fun. I've got some hats over here that maybe represent some of the theme of this podcast. This is for my good friend Forth in North Carolina. He's an App State guy, and I know any of you University of Michigan folks probably are getting a little bit upset with me wearing this hat from years ago. Anyway, all that being said, 1.73. I mean, does App State let folks in that have that? Anyway, all that being said, all joking around. There's a few that really stood out for me, Henry, over this past year in 2025. The first one, not first one because it's number one. It's just like the first one that comes to mind. John LaFontaine, who you met and invited to be one of our guests, who is this amazing gentleman at Cranbrook and runs their hockey program at Cranbrook. But I think there's a number of things that John shared. I looked at this through what are the messages? He shared at one point in that conversation, he came to that point where his brother, Pat LaFontaine, those of you in the hockey world will recognize that name as a professional hockey player, was John's brother. Pat went on to play in the NHL, and John didn't. And it was that moment he realized, I'm not cut out for this. Perhaps I'm not good enough for that level of play. I just really appreciated when people can look in the mirror and say, have the courage to say, I'm not it. And that was for me one of those in our conversations where when you put in the context or theme of mission over measure, where maybe John's just saying that wasn't his mission to play in the NHL. His mission was to coach, guide, mentor young men in the world of hockey, but at a different place. So that was I just really appreciated that. Him as a guest, but certainly that conversation.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point you bring up the other side of it, which is he wasn't called to it. I think there's a hole you can dig yourself in when you say, oh, I'm not cut out for this. And then, the doubt and the questions of well, am I cut out for anything? What am I going to do? And you end up in that spiral where there is no path forward. But if you frame it more as, maybe I'm not called to this, there's something else I am to. It's just not this. I think he discovered, and I hope other people discover that there's something else waiting out there for you. You just got to go find it. And one of the notes I wrote down for his conversation was surrendering the ordinary world. I think that was a good theme that I pulled from our conversation with him and it's on your point, your topic as well. The idea that, in order to accept that you're not cut out for something, you got to, that's your ordinary world. Hockey was his ordinary world, playing at high level for his whole life was, and having to surrender that ordinary world, the complacency, the routine of it all, is probably really hard for him. It's hard for anybody trying to surrender their normal routine, knowing that it's not the path forward. But I thought that was just a good theme, and on the topic of our mission over measure and kind of hero's journey.
Well, and it's such a great point, because isn't that what all of us as heroines are called to do, is actually surrender the things that we know, which could be literally the physical environment we find ourselves in or the relationships we find ourselves in. It could be the ideas of I'll call it the dreams we have in the moment, could be part of an ordinary world. And if we're willing to surrender, I've always come to the understanding that hero's journey framework, that call to adventure, the number one ingredient requirement is that you surrender. You surrender all that is currently in existence at that point in time and be willing to step out into the unknown. John's just a great example. He shared a number of examples in that conversation of moments when he needed to say, okay, I don't have this. I don't have the answer. God, where, and especially in his life, like, God, where should I go next? And I also appreciated just the whole, he mentioned something, and this for me, Henry, ties back to, and perhaps it really resonates with me personally, on the measures part, that inside of that, it's almost like we could change the title of this to doing what's right versus buying into judgment, something along those lines, because he mentioned, like, he said, God doesn't judge you. And I thought, man, that's so great. Like, all the different measures that we put up against, that we either create ourselves, judging ourselves, or are presented or manufactured for us, judgment from or by others. And that, at the end of the day, it's like, nah, put all that judgment aside, put those measures aside.
Yeah.
So about relationships, Joe Mackey, in his conversation, you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. I'm sure you're saying, man, I need to spend less time with my dad. I need to spend less time with my family.
What happens if one of those 5 is my cat? What does that mean?
Yeah, right. Oh, you mean like
he's number 1,
raising the average?
Yeah. If the 5 people are scaled, he's number 1. So I don't know what that does for me.
I love that. It's just again, great look in the mirror. And so I'm going to tie Joe Mackey's comment about the 5 people back to John LaFontaine, or the hero's journey, is that as we're on these paths, you realize I might, like, where I need to go next, the mission that I'm pursuing in the next stage of that, I might not have the right team with me. And I think it's very appropriate for those of us business owners that have teams. I'm hopeful that Joe's comments give us some level of permission to say, or at least to inquire, at least to question, do I have the right team? Do I have the right 5 people on my leadership team? Do I have the right 5 people outside of my business? Do I have the right 5 peers that are supporting me in my professional life, in my spiritual life, in my health life? Yeah, that was just a great reminder, those 5 people.
Yeah, and I basically wrote down the same thing. It's the, what did he say specifically? The company you keep can determine your future. I think that's what it was. He was talking about that talk he went to when he was younger. That guy said, I can look at the people around you and I can see your future. And it's very much on point with that. And it's something obviously very closely tied to the hero's journey. It's that whole stage of allies, enemies. For the sake of the example, instead of 5 people, it's 9 in Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring. You have that whole point is figuring out the right team to go on this adventure with, on this mission with. And it's extremely important to have the awareness to recognize that, people can be a right fit, people can. It's not just they can do the job, or I just need them. It's like, well, no, find the right fit, find your allies. Don't keep your enemies, find your allies.
So what would be a characteristic that you'd look for in an ally?
I would say honesty. I think using Lord of the Rings as an example, I think it's, someone almost everybody can understand. You have Legolas, who is, he's this elvish character. He's kind of, mysterious and mystical, but he's honest to a fault, especially when it comes to, I forget the dwarf's name, but they always have banter where they're going back and forth and always telling each other like the harsh truth via a joke. And I think that spirit is something really important to have, because when you there are harsh truths in the world, and I would much rather have someone on my team willing to tell me the harsh truth. And whether or not they inject comedy into it is not really important, but willing to tell me the harsh truth over an easy lie. You look at Boromir, who's constantly tempted by the ring, and he tries to keep it hidden. He's not truthful about his temptations. And it ends up playing out the way it does. We won't spoil it in case anybody hasn't seen it, even though it's a very old story that's kind of on you at this point. But my point is, the harsh truth is something that everybody needs to hear, and having people around you that will tell it to you. And on your side, on your responsibility, being someone that can hear it and accept it.
It's such a great point. The easy lie, harsh truth, someone that's willing to share the harsh truth versus share the easy lie. It's interesting because you break that down, you go back to the concept of judgment. Is someone who's sharing harsh truth with you judging you? Or is someone who's sharing harsh truth with you, is someone who's sharing an easy lie judging you? Judging you in the manner, perhaps saying, well, Henry won't be strong enough to hear that truth or to witness that truth or to accept that truth. So it's interesting as you break that down, not to go off on a total tangent, but just sharing the harsh truth might be like, oh, what you're doing or who you're being isn't working. It's not supporting the journey we're on or the path we're on. It's not going to help us fulfill this mission. Versus, oh, it's fine, Henry. Like, that's just a really great reminder not to use the truth as a weapon, but to use the truth as a building block, a step forward.
Yeah, that's a great point. And kind of tied into that, I wrote down for our second episode with Alex Draper, it was a very kind of one-off comment at the end, but it was, "Am I the asshole?" I think it was a funny thing we joked about at the end, but it had a lot of self-reflection baked into it that I think was kind of tied earlier in our conversation that we had. But recognizing that, it's like, okay, if someone comes to bring you the truth, and how do you react to it? If you're, if you don't want to hear it, if you don't want to accept it, what is that? I think there's just a level of self-awareness that you should have, especially if you're the leader of that team, someone's bringing it to you.
Well, and if you're the person, if you discover that you're the person that says, well, everybody's an a-hole, doesn't that include you?
Mm-hmm.
And if everyone is, then no one is, except perhaps you.
Mm-hmm.
It takes guts to look in the mirror and own up to, it's my fault. I remember when you and Georgia were really young, we must have watched Bug's Life 17,000 times.
Good movie.
Great movie. Disney made some good movies, or Pixar made some good movies back then. I'm not so sure now, so sorry for folks that are big Disney fans currently. Anyway, different topic, different podcast, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
There's a scene, Kevin Spacey plays the lead grasshopper. Julia Louis-Dreyfus plays the up-and-coming Queen Ant. Joan Rivers was the Queen Ant at that time. And Hopper, the grasshopper, is demanding that, or indicating to Julia Louis-Dreyfus, you failed. You did not collect all the food you were supposed to for us as grasshoppers, which was apparently the ant's job. She's making all sorts of excuses. And Hopper cuts her off in mid-sentence and says, the number one rule of leadership. And I love there's this moment where she's totally threatened by this grasshopper, by this authority figure, this intimidating, like physically much larger than she, failed in the job, her number one job that she was assigned. She's making all these excuses. And he says, the number one rule of leadership, everything is your fault. That could probably be pretty intimidating for most folks, but I couldn't recite any other scene, even though we did literally watch that with you guys 17,000 times. That's the only thing I remember about that movie. And what I'm left with is like, man, if I went about looking through the lens of everything's my fault, it's not all the bad stuff. Like I get to take credit for the good things that are happening too. But what if I embarked on my mission realizing that all of it's my responsibility? Like my hand is in everything. What I actually have an opportunity to put my mark on everything. So be really responsible for what that mark is. And that ties back to what Alex said. And am I the asshole? Like, what a great question. Pause every once in a while and just simply ask that question. If you experience yourself in the midst of a-holes, you might want to ask that question once in a while.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Especially if the company you keep determines your future, Going back to what Joe Mackey's lesson,
If you're hanging around 5 a-holes, the answer to am I the a-hole is probably affirmative.
There's a good chance. There's a very good chance. No, but that's a great example. And it kind of ties into our first conversation with Gianni where he talked about risk has intrinsic responsibility. And so when you take on any sort of risk, it's coming with the responsibility that it's your risk. Okay. It's like, this is, your responsibility to not mitigate this risk, but take it on. Building a business has risk. You're investing money. Leading a team, there's always risk because you might fail. And looking at it through the lens of, if something goes wrong, it's everyone else's fault but mine. But then when something goes right, it's no one's responsibility but mine. Instead of taking it like you just said, everything is my fault, you get the good and the bad, and it's your responsibility.
Yeah, it just is, his story is so great with being in business with family. I think it was his dad, it was his cousin, I think it was, and it didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
Like either the business didn't work or the relationship didn't work. And Gianni, what he shared, how he handled it, was such a great example of like a little bit. He didn't use those words, but probably asked a similar question that Alex Draper did about, like, am I the problem? Am I the one? And realizing that, maybe I need to take responsibility for this relationship not working, this business not working. I'm going to go down a different path. Sometimes it makes sense to take yourself out of that current circumstance. Again, tie it back to what you mentioned earlier about hero's journey. Johnny's call to adventure was perhaps the involuntary push that we experience where our ordinary world shoves us into something new. The other way is, this just is no longer satisfactory. I need to go on an adventure on my own. It's the voluntary and involuntary ignition, if you will, of an adventure. Yeah, this is another great example of somebody who's accomplished a lot of really great things in life. One of the pillars has been taking responsibility.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think a good aspect of that was with Rick Suckowitz. He talked about when you take on risk, when you start something, not giving yourself a way out. I thought that was really powerful. Not giving yourself an easy way to walk away. Like you got to marry yourself to this. You got to tie yourself to whatever you're doing. I think that's really important because it's like, well, is it really an adventure if you're only one toe in? If your pinky toe is only in the pool, is it? I don't think it is.
Yeah, Mom and I went to this conference a few weeks ago, and one of the speakers, Father Mike Schmitz, was explaining, was it him or someone? Anyway, somebody said, it's interesting, a Disney movie. So I'm going to plug and criticize Disney movies. Disney movies used to be about the hero transforming so as to make the world better. That was the Disney of yesterday. The Disney of today is the world needs to transform to serve the hero or heroine. Like, that's a fundamental philosophical shift. And
Mm-hmm.
in my opinion, is terrible, where we're expecting the world to, was it assuage itself to us and our demands versus, no, the world's actually this thing that just keeps moving forward, and you gotta be the one to transform so as to live successfully within it. All that being said, Rick's a great example. He shared for me, 'cause Rick was one of the ones that I captured as well. When we started working together, there were three owners. They weren't getting along so well. It was bumpy. They decided to move forward, implementing a new system, a new framework, new process that was going to inject a bunch of accountability and discipline into it, and it was totally disruptive initially. And yet it was, looking at like what's the transformation that the ownership went through in that journey that actually had them all transform. And as a literally a direct witness of that process with Rick and his team, they probably, Henry, in the 12 years I've been doing this kind of work with leadership teams, from an ownership team perspective, they probably are an example. They are an example of the greatest level of transformation, each one of them. They're fundamentally different people in a great way now. They've found their unique capabilities. They found their path. And it was that total disruption along the way that allowed them, offered an opportunity to transform. But along the way, what they did is they've had breakthroughs in that business that have just been amazing. Like, it is not the same business that it was 5, 7 years ago when we started working together. By the way, I was just a guide along the way. I was just a helper along the way. They did 99.9% of the work. Rick and Tim and Bob and Matt and Melissa, and I mean, all of them over there at their shop.
And how much of that idea of being, I guess, all in, not giving yourself a way out, accepting the risk 100%, how much of that played into their success and transformation?
So sealing all the escape hatches, like literally welding them shut. There were a few that they left open initially, and then they realized that's not serving us. We're actually going to weld them shut. And it wasn't pretty. It got rough along the way because you didn't have that pressure release mechanism in place. So they just had to deal with it. They actually had to confront the things that weren't working about the business. They had to confront the things that weren't working about their relationship. That was probably the more important thing to work on, was their relationship. And not just with one another, but fundamentally, again, go back to Alex Draper's question, am I the a-hole? And that got asked a few times, and which was terrific. And it's interesting because I think, again, what I wrote down with Rick was accountability and alignment can cause conflict. That was the phrase that really stuck with me from Rick's conversation. That, I could apply that to a few things, because he did share a little bit about him in the transition of running the business for a long time to now they're going through a succession process with a new leader and new team. He shared how, like, it's difficult to step away, but again, I'm buying into it, the alignment, and I'm going to play my role in the transition. That's the accountability, and it does cause bumps. So I guess the punchline for me is, don't understand the value of accountability, the value of alignment, but don't kid yourself to think that it's going to be a smooth path with kittens and rainbows.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like what you brought up about, learning to give up that control. And I think it's a theme that has probably played itself out in our conversations, but it's that hero's journey. It's there's never one just hero's journey in your life. You're constantly restarting the process over and over and over again. So at the beginning of you working with them, it's their call to adventure you know, is sealing the pressure hatches. It's taking on all the responsibility they can. It's really giving 100% to this new goal. And then they transform. And then the new hero's journey arises where Rick, someone else, has to give up that control and from the transformation they just went on. It's a whole new cycle that goes through. And I think that's an important theme that's kind of not specific to one conversation we've had, but has kind of reappeared where there's that constant cycling of restarting the hero's journey. You go through that process, you take the reward of what you learned, and you are able to use that to go on to the next journey.
Yeah, and Craig Houston shared something again that just very memorable for me. He said it this way: put a target on the back of regret. And it was interesting because he was sharing how, and this kind of ties into at least Rick as an example of an owner that's transitioning into what's next in life after having had a very successful entrepreneurial career. Craig shared in his work, he used the number 70% of owners that sell their businesses regret that process or have some form of regret afterwards. I thought that's a massive number. That means 7 out of 10 owners that have sold their businesses are experiencing some significant level of regret. And Craig was like, why are we doing that? Like, let's literally put a target on the back of regret. In other words, it exists, but is there a way to kill it off in some way, shape, or form? And the question that came up to me as I was listening to our conversation with Craig was like, where does regret originate? And I keep coming back to, well, that's the tie back in for me in this concept of measure, and say, well, I didn't measure up, therefore I regret. And I'm wondering how many, in this specific case, how many owners that reach the opportunity of selling their business where in some way, shape, or form, there's some measure that's left incomplete. And that incomplete measure or relationship to that measure is the thing that causes the regret.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I like that. And it kind of, I look at what Alan Bruford had talked about, which is something we've brought up numerous times throughout our conversation since then, which is your mission is your compass and your measures are your gauges. And, in that example, it's probably something like, exactly, they're
just
switched.
Turn it around. Exactly.
They turn it around. If you don't, measures can be important because they can keep you on track on the day to day. But if you don't have a mission, or if your mission isn't aligned with what you actually want, none of those measures matter, and they can end up holding a lot more power over you because you feel like you're constantly going against the measures. I'm not measuring up to this all the time, but in reality, those measures are part of a mission that you're not even on, or you don't even want to be on.
Yeah, and then sometimes you get shoved into it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe that's where you don't want to be on. Or John and Joe Graziano, I love John's story, how it's shared about, his dad passed away, and the insurance guy that was his dad's boss brought his mom, sat her into the kitchen, either immediately following his dad's passing or maybe even during like the funeral, and said, or even to John, your dad had one policy. John's like, wait a minute. And the dad had a bunch of policies. I mean, he's in the insurance business. The guy's like, no, he just had one. And it wasn't enough. And, that realization of like, oh my gosh, how could, I think the message I got was how John was like looking at this guy saying like, how could you probably tie this back into the Joe Mackey comment about your average of the 5 people. How could, this isn't about John's dad. This is like the guy that John's dad worked for just would sell John or tell John's dad to just take all your earnings and dumping it by the next biggest policy, the next biggest policy. Take what you've earned, next biggest policy. The message that John was sharing was like, I'm in this business because I want to do the right thing for people, not the most profitable thing. And just to be clear, like the Graziano brothers have created a very nice business for themselves. It's just, keeping in mind that, the mission perhaps for John and Joe's dad's boss was the almighty dollar. And I'm a card carrying capitalist. I'm going to be crystal clear on that. Like, profit is capability, but he probably wasn't doing the right thing. And John started his CPA and wealth management business because he realized like there's a lot of families that they're getting bad advice. There are people they're talking to that are not doing the right thing.
Yeah. And I think it's important to draw out of that story that he took that negative moment and transformed it into a positive. I'm sure it would have been super easy for him to just, like what we were talking about earlier, is to not take on any responsibility. Not that it was his responsibility, that's how it played out, but his responsibility to do something about it. He could have easily just kept, blaming the insurance guy, blaming the circumstances, blaming whatever he could but himself, but he didn't. And he stopped and he took on that responsibility to do something about it, which, is extremely important. I would say for anyone, but especially someone, working in their own business, starting their own business, that idea of it's all your fault. Even if it really isn't, it's all your fault, because if you tell yourself it's all your fault, you'll always have an opportunity to do something about it.
Yeah. Reminds me of a more recent one that we did late in the year with when we recorded it. It's probably going to be coming out maybe about this time, similar time that this does, with Father Mark Livingston. I remember saying there's two things I remember from that conversation. So there's a sickness in business, almost like an illness in business. And the next thing I remember specifically was he used the term measure mentality. There's a measure mentality. I thought that's an interesting way to look at it. And is it the measure mentality where like all we're thinking about is like measures, measures, measures? So in other words, go back to Alan Bruford. We're totally focused on the gauges. We're not paying attention to the compass or where we're being directed. And I would equate that to, I think that's probably where Father Mark was going. It was like, you're not healthy if you are consumed with the measure mentality. And it's not to say that you and I talked about this, and certainly with guests, measures aren't bad. They're terrific indicators, but they're not the definition. They're not the things that define who we are. They're not the compass that directs us to where we're headed. And there is a trap that I've fallen into around the measure. I mean, just go back to high school GPA. Who the heck, how many people, when I share that with people, 1.73, it's almost always the response. It's like, it's the 1.73 question mark. That's the response 99% of the time. Almost like, you've got to be kidding me. I'm like, no, it's literally just call New Shore High School in Winnetka, Illinois, ask for my cumulative GPA, and that's what it is. They just wanted me out, is my feeling. But had I used that measure as my compass, I don't know what would have happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good point, because I think it's easy, and I know I've definitely fallen into that trap of using a measure not as a way to, what would you say, to make myself feel bad, but to give an excuse as to, oh, that's someone else's measure on me. That doesn't really matter. It's a way out. It can absolutely be a way out of responsibility of whatever you're working towards. I think there's obviously, we've talked about, there are measures that may not be useful, but it's going back to the idea of, well, they're probably a part of a mission that you're not supposed to be on, or that, you know, you need to change. I think that's really, as we've been doing this podcast over the last year, the mission over measure idea has kind of shifted from that. I think originally, maybe a part of it, at least for me, was like, oh yeah, I have a bit of a chip on my shoulder, like mission over measure, 1.73, like who cares? What? It's useless. But it's kind of evolved into, well, measures are important, yes, but they're all part of a mission. The more important part is making sure that you're on the right mission.
Yeah, we can leave the house, and without a destination, we're just literally gonna just go around the block a million times. The measures are the milestones, and they're great. Like, I know I've gotten that much further in my path. I want to say there's a Lawrence, Iron Mike. He's the guy that did these. He completed 101 triathlons consecutively. Iron Mike Lawrence, I think. No, anyway, look him up. Google Iron something Lawrence triathlons. It's an amazing story. He shared at one point, I don't know what it was, like his 67th, marathon that he was running in this series of 100 triathlons. It's insane, by the way, in my opinion. That in California, he'd have people like running alongside him, encouraging him. And this one guy, he recounts the story of this guy running alongside him saying, "Oh, this is great. You've only got 13 more miles to go." Like, this other runner thinking that's going to encourage him. He's like, "What? No, I don't." He's like, "Yeah, you've got 13 more miles to go." It's like, "No, I have one more mile to go." And as he was telling it, you realize, oh, what he's doing is he only looks at that short-term measure of 1 mile. I just need to complete that. And then guess what? I need to complete the next mile, and then the next mile. That's a really long way to say the measures are important. Like, those milestones are important. It got him through 101 triathlons. I don't recommend that to anybody, but just another great reminder for me, Henry, on measures are not bad. It's how we interpret them or how we use them where we can get wrapped around the axle.
Yeah, that's a great example, and I think we'll wrap things up there. I'd like to take a moment to first thank all of our guests, Gianni, Alex, Alan, Joe and John, Rick, Joe, Tony, Craig, John, and Father Mark. Thank you so much and Peggy, of course. Thank you so much for being on the Mission Over Measure podcast. This was a great first year of conversations. We hope everybody that listened enjoyed, and I also want to thank everyone who listened and hopefully enjoyed. Thank you for listening. Thank you for wanting to be a part of this. Thank you for sharing the show with everyone you know. It's been really fun to hear people's thoughts, hear people's comments. The surprise face that we get when, the two guys with very low GPAs somehow started a podcast. It's great. So we want to thank everybody who's helped us along the way. Give us shout outs. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Henry, just a great reminder. All of our guests have been amazing. We're looking forward to another year of amazing conversations as well. And make sure to like, subscribe, and share this podcast with others. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks.